Hello and a very good morning to you. We're live from London. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. And coming up today, my guests will share their views on the week's biggest stories. Isabel, Hilton and David Bodanis are standing by. Isabel, good morning. What have you spotted?
Well, of course, I think the air is still full of Trump versus Musk in its various guises, and it's rather blocking out some other rather interesting stories, like Trump sending the National Guard to Los Angeles. That's a serious escalation, and I think part of the playbook where he creates a state of emergency, no more elections, whatever. This is not good news.
Thank you for that. We'll be heading to Oslo for the latest.
I'm Lars Bevanger, Monocle's Oslo correspondent, and this morning I'm talking about a shock win restoring faith in Norway's national football team and an update on that container ship parked in a man's garden.
Plus we head to Italy for the latest from the referendum that's being held today and tomorrow. It's the 8th of June 2025. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you. We're live in London. You're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, and around the desk we have David Bodanis and we have Isabel Hilton. Good morning, team. How are we?
We are very well and delighted to be here.
But you were somewhat sunnier and more drenched in rosé this week, weren't you, Isabel?
Well, yes, and it's a painful memory in that I had to come back after 24 hours. I went to the south of France and it was so beautiful. Lovely day, excellent food, very nice people.
What were you doing out there?
I was giving a talk on geopolitics and climate change to some very nice people who promote offshore wind. But I only had 24 hours. So I got a glimpse of paradise. I felt I was being expelled for some terrible crime.
I hate to say this, but did you fly?
Yes.
Whoops.
How else was I going to get there? I know.
That's the rub, isn't it?
Yeah, I do use don't use disposable coffee cups. I know. It is a problem.
It is a big problem, isn't it? But actually, but the trouble is when you fly into Nice, which is one of the great cities in the world to fly into, actually, because you have that, it's built out into the sea, isn't it?
And it's very beautiful, yeah.
And it's very, very beautiful that actually it is the only way to arrive in Nice, unless you're on a yacht. Were you on a yacht?
I was not on a yacht.
Not on a yacht. This is your corner of the world, isn't it, south of France, David Bodanis?
In my youth, I used to go there not on a yacht and not in an airplane, but taking the overnight train from London. And when you turn the corner around Marseille and you wake up, the air smells differently than Victoria Station smells.
It does, just a little bit. You stayed there for what, how long?
Well, I went for a little visit, and I'm an exceptionally lazy person, so I stayed there on and off for about a decade till I was losing my English. So I started spending half the year in the centre of London, half the year in a little village in France.
And what did you do out there?
The great thing about being young and having no expectations for yourself or from your family is you don't have to do anything. So I was able for quite a while to do almost nothing. At one point, years later, I had to apply for some job and have a CV. And I couldn't remember much of that decade. And it wasn't even drugs.
The empty CV.
Good suntan.
Drenched in sun.
I tease, but if you take a little bit of time away from the rush of what's going on, you have a chance of coming up with fresh ideas. So I got into my writing career.
How did you? We'll explore that a little bit in later on about how you step back and have a bit of time to think.
Yeah, if it's too long, you go fruity and start writing people letters in purple crayon. But a few years can be excellent.
Indeed. Maybe we should we'll be talking about Donald Trump and Elon Musk in a minute. Do you think they need a quick trip to the south of France?
They need a visit to the south of the Mariana Trench.
Okay, we'll come to that in a minute. But first, let's head to Milan to hear from our Europe editor at large, Ed Stocker. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning. I feel bad about pulling it back from the revelry of the south of France and rosé to talk about a referendum.
We'll come to the referendum in a minute. What's the Milanese equivalent of rosé and sunshine? Well, basically, Giorgia Meloni's told everybody to go to the beach today, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But that thing when you just step back and have a bit of fun. Where do the Milanese go? Where do you go?
They all head to Liguria, don't they? I'm here working, so no, I'm here in Milan. A lot of people, as soon as the temperature dulls up a bit, they head en masse for the Liguria coastline, just because it's the nearest beach to Milan. So yeah, my neighbourhood's pretty quiet, to be honest with you, right now.
But does the
It's nice
pace
and peaceful because everyone's at the beach.
does the
Or
pace of
possibly
life
voting.
slow? Sorry about that. Does the pace of life genuinely slow? I mean, are you finding that as the mercury rises in June, that people actually do less work, or do you just do more work and get cross?
Well, any excuse in Italy, right? No, that's not fair. No, I mean, I've been in Milan almost 5 years now, and one of the things that's been different compared to the other places I've lived in is there is a serious culture, and a lot of people say it's not like it was 10, 20 years ago when it was even more so like this, but there is definitely a culture of leaving at the weekends. People work hard during the week and they get out at weekends, and it's the same in the winter. In the winter, they head for the mountains. In the summer, they head for the beaches. So there is, the city does considerably get quieter at the weekends. And there's sort of this old joke that you can't organise a dinner party at the weekend because everyone's away. You have to do it during the week.
And do you actually have that thing now? Because in London on a Thursday evening, it's like the biggest Friday night you've ever seen. And then Friday during the day is still now rather quiet. I'm going to say a very rude word, actually, that there's an acronym for the people who only work on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They are quietly called the twat. And they're the people who just don't bother coming into work on a Monday and Friday. Has Milan got that population of people like that, or is everybody still nose to the grindstone?
Well, whenever there's a holiday that may fall, sometimes you have like a midweek or a Thursday or, one of these national holidays, they have this thing called a ponte, like a bridge in which people basically take the time off in between to give themselves a nice long weekend. So that is definitely a cultural thing that people get heartily involved in.
Excellent.
And fair play to them. Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's a good thing.
Well, look, it's a weekend in Italy and it's quite sunny, and Giorgia Meloni's told everybody to go to the beach because she doesn't want people to vote. Is that correct?
She definitely doesn't want people to vote. Yeah, I mean the left and the centre are supporting this vote. It's safe to say that Giorgia Meloni definitely isn't. She apparently intends to turn up at a polling station, presumably in Rome, but then not withdraw the voting card. So she's sort of going to turn up to acknowledge the fact that there is a referendum taking place today and tomorrow, but she won't, ask for the card, take the card, which would then register her vote, which would then contribute towards this possible quorum. So just to give a bit of a backstory, this is a sort of a citizen referendum, as in it's a referendum, one of these referendums that's able to bypass Parliament initially by gathering more than 500,000 votes. There are 5 referendums taking place today. 4 are to do with work and essentially making it harder to fire people. It's already pretty hard to fire people in Italy, I have to say. And the other one is on citizenship, reducing the number of years for non-European Union members who are legally residing in Italy from 10 years to 5 years. This would include me, by the way. What's euphemistically called the centre right in media in Italy, i.e. the far right, is not interested in this, doesn't want it to happen, and so there's been very little in terms of publicity, really. There's some posters dotted around Milan, but it's safe to say that the government's not really trying to get people out to vote. I mentioned that word quorum before. Essentially, in order for this to be valid, half plus 1 of the eligible voters would need to turn out to vote today. So that would be roughly 25 million people would need to go and vote today. When you think about the people at the beach, that might be more difficult. But there is tomorrow. Actually, between 1974 and 1995, when there were referendums, that quorum was often met. But since 1997, it hasn't been the case. It largely hasn't met this quorum figure. The last one, to give you an idea, was in 2011 that magic number was reached. So the first hurdle, really, regardless of whether it's yes or no, would be getting enough people to go out and vote to make it an actual valid referendum, Emma.
And it's a difficult question that they're all being asked, and this is where the great controversy is coming, is to whether they should reduce the legally required residency in the country from 5 to 10 years. That would include you. There's an awful lot of people who believe that it should still stay at 10 years, aren't there?
I mean, there's a lot of people on the right, but I mean, speaking personally, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer when you look at the demographics of Italy. It has one of the lowest birth rates in Europe. In fact, the 2024 figure was 1.18 child per woman. That's down from the lowest figure before, back in 1995 of 1.19. So you have an aging population. The positive rub is that life expectancy is getting higher, but you have a massively aging population and Italians who simply aren't having kids. And so there's a strong argument to be made that Italy needs the workers. It needs new Italians to come and live here. And when you have a process that is 10 years, it's not just actually 10 years, Emma, because the bureaucratic system, red tape, the cogs of the system turn very slowly. So it's 10 years plus possibly 3 or 4. So you're talking, it might take up to 14 years to get citizenship if you've been living here legally. And of course it has this knock-on effect because there is no birthright in Italy. It's through this bloodline. And so if you are born to legally residing parents who are foreign, you don't get citizenship. And in fact, you don't get citizenship. You're not able to apply until you're 18 years. And so you have someone who's born in Italy, speaks the language fluently, knows the culture in and out because it's the only country they've lived in, who are not legally recognized as being Italian until they turn 18. And so if you reduce this figure from 10 to 5, it would have the knock-on effect of maybe at least one parent would be an Italian citizen when a child is born. And so they wouldn't have to be born when, I guess, the stigma of not being recognized as Italian citizens. And it would help, hopefully, to integration more generally. That, of course, is my very personal take.
Indeed, and it's one of those things that actually there's been large amounts of coverage as to how widely this has actually been debated. Rai, the TV station, has been accused of not giving it enough coverage because, as you say, it is an enormously important issue for a country with low birth rates and big issues with immigration, like so many countries in the European Union. Why do you think people are trying to brush this under the carpet?
Well, I don't think it's so much people trying to brush it under the carpet. It is very much, like you mentioned before, Giorgia Meloni and the government, and Rai, which is, of course, the national network, has been, Meloni's been accused in the past, not that she's been the only leader in the past to have done it, of sort of trying to fashion and shape Rai in her image. And so, a lot of people in important positions are sort of Meloni people in Rai. And so that would explain why it hasn't had the sufficient debate. I think, again, from a personal point of view, it's sad that there hasn't been more of a debate. Il Post, which is unashamedly centre-left, you could say, publication, was sort of looking at the comparing with Switzerland, the fact that whenever there's a referendum there, every citizen by law receives a sort of booklet that explains the referendum process. It outlines the arguments on both sides. So at least the citizenry is informed. I think in this case, there's simply going to be a lot of ignorance. A lot of people don't know, not just in the citizenship debate, which is perhaps easier to grasp, but also in the 4 other referendums on work. They won't really know enough about it. So it's a shame, I think, that people aren't being better informed by there being more of a public debate around these subjects because, Meloni has really tried to up the birth rate. She's talked about family. She's made it a centre of her government. It's been such a strong focus. But the reality is, the birth rate hasn't improved. The situation hasn't changed in Italy. And so the left and the centre are realistic in the sense that they're like, look, we might not get this 50% plus one vote. There's roughly 25 million people turning out today. But at the very least, they're trying to get this sort of second place idea, which is if we can't get 25 billion, let's get over 12,300,000 because that's the number of votes Meloni received in the 2022 election. They're saying if we can get more people voting for the citizenship to be changed, then Meloni won in her election in 2022. That will be a strong message disaffection with this current government. So that will be interesting to see, at the very least, if that can be achieved, Emma.
Ed Stocker, we will keep across this and probably come back to you on Tuesday when we get the results in. Ed Stocker, Europe's editor-at-large in Milan, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle on Sunday. And this is a European problem, isn't it? That idea, David and Isabel, that there are practicalities associated with population figures, birth rates, immigration, citizenship, everything that Ed was talking about, and yet it is such a politically charged subject is immigration. Who wants to kick off with that one, Isabel?
You're absolutely right, and I mean the problem with the parties of the right demonising inward migration is that they don't have an answer as to who's going to do all the jobs that we need in societies where, like Italy, the birth rate is falling and society is arranging. This is true across Europe. And it's become a kind of political football, but it's completely against the interests of, a lot of people in this country who need skilled and unskilled labour for just, carrying on daily life, let alone the added richness, I think, that inward migration brings to a society. I sometimes try to imagine the British High Street if we'd had no inward migration. Can you imagine how dull it would be?
Well, we'd all be Anglo-Saxon for starters.
Well, we would all be Anglo-Saxon.
Inward migration in 1066.
That's true. Yes, I have Huguenot ancestry, so I wouldn't be here. But imagine no Indian restaurants, no Italian, no restaurants, no French bakeries. I mean, heavens, what a dull place.
It is an interesting case in point in London as one of the most diverse cities on earth. We were having lunch yesterday with someone from northern India, northern Italy, an Australian, a Japanese, and myself, a Brit. And I said, we're all a table of migrants here. And they said, but you're not a migrant. I went, yes, I am. I'm not from London. And there is that general acceptance that it is a culture of London becomes the magnet. But David, for the Italians, this is a completely different kettle of fish, isn't it? Because when you got someone like Giorgia Meloni in charge, the practicalities become swept to one side.
Especially when a country most needs it, it's the country's going to feel most fragile. So Italy knows it's weakening. It knows that the essence of what they have is in the past. That's been a problem with Italy for a long time, but especially now, the post-war industrial strength and like the northern Italian industries and stuff, they realize it's getting weak because of this underlying base. Think of a teenager who has a large zit on their nose. The last thing they want to talk about is the zit on their nose. So it's kind of embarrassing, but it's the fragile countries which A, both need it, and B, are most aware of it.
And no one seems to get it right either, do they?
It's really hard. And also, so at the moment, London is fairly good, is indeed very good. But historically, as you know, sadly, it never lasts. These big multicultural cities, Vienna 130 years ago, and London and stuff, they almost always fall apart. They go into like tribal hatreds, and a group that's losing out manages to get some power and manipulates. I hope London is an exception. It's not inevitable. New York's had a certain amount of diversity and held it really well with pride for quite a while. But in general, it doesn't work.
And people were talking about yesterday around, the table of migrants is talking about how living standards in London have dropped because of the population increase. And you end up scratching your head. One of them was an Italian friend who's already voted in the referendum and has voted to keep the immigration duration, the residency duration at 10 years. You sort of slightly scratch your head there thinking, well, hang on a minute, why do you go up the ladder and then kick it down?
Well, exactly. Yeah.
But there's that issue, isn't there, that lots of people here in the United Kingdom don't want to do the jobs that migrants want to do. There's a survey, and studies are now showing that there is a big problem across lots of societies, not just in the United Kingdom, where older workers are struggling, are falling out of the workforce and are struggling to get back into the workforce. But when they are said, well, there are jobs in, let's say, caring and nursing, what have you, nobody wants to do them.
Denmark has gotten around that a little bit by having better salaries. So there's some jobs that people won't want to do, But if the salary goes up substantially, a number of people think there's something to it. And it goes in the reverse direction. You remember a couple generations ago, banking was kind of a dull job. The kid who couldn't do something interesting would go into there. It was being like a very straightforward engineer. And there was no thought of spectacular salaries, and it didn't attract spectacular or even spectacularly awful, but didn't attract people who were above the norm in any way. So we could adjust it.
And let's look at what's happening in the United States just this very morning. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this program, Isabel, that protests against raids on illegal immigration in Los Angeles have now prompted Donald Trump to send in the military, the National Guard. And everybody is saying, well, hang on a minute, the last time the National Guard had to be sent into Los Angeles was in the early 1990s in the riots. And that's when it was the whole city that had gone up. And it was the governor at the time who requested federal help. This is different. This is the White House sending in what appears to be a political, well, many are interpreting it as a purely political gesture.
Absolutely, and it's very, very unusual. You had to dig up, the Trump administration specializes in digging up obscure laws from hundreds of years ago to justify what he's doing. It is extremely unusual for the president to send the National Guard without it being requested by the governor of the state, because the governor of the state reads the situation, says we can't cope, we need help. This is entirely different. This is the prosecution of a very unpopular policy in a very, very aggressive way, which has caused resistance, as it would, particularly in communities that are largely Hispanic. But sending in the National Guard will inflame the situation, as the governor says. So, this is, I think this is very much of a match with the whole tenor of the Trump administration, which is to do things which are going to cause distress, resistance, many of which are quite cruel, many of which have been challenged in court, but the challenge has been ignored, and then to escalate the situation with violence.
Yes.
And I think this is absolutely Trump's playbook.
Yes, and it's been the playbook of many people like him in the past.
Indeed.
There's all those the sort of in-depth interviews where on average, left voters or Democratic voters in America would often identify with the state as a mother, and the more conservative ones would identify with the state as a father. One is to nurture, one is to protect. And if you can make the world look dangerous, then you need this strong father. Many people will pay little attention. They won't know what happened in L.A., and they'll see scenes of fighting on the street. Ideally for Trump, it would be wonderful if a National Guard person gets hurt.
Indeed.
Because that could be filmed, and then you need a stronger father and you need a protection.
And indeed, and you can have the other. You can have the illegal immigrant.
Othering is very good. Alfred Hitchcock once said that if you show a crime and then watch the police try to follow the criminal, you identify with the police. If you have the criminal hiding in a corner as the police are going by, and you're from the perspective of the criminal, you really hope the police don't see you. So depending where the cameras are, you either have a riot by citizens or you have a riot by police, depending on which side it's looking out.
And I think the more stories that come out of people who are pillars of their community being snatched off the street and put into detention. There was a case of a woman called Carol in a small town in Missouri. Mother worked in the local diner. The entire town loved her. And she was snatched by ICE. And this is a town that voted for Donald Trump. And I think the more stories there are like that, she's now been released, by the way, because of popular sentiment and the actions of her lawyers. But, the more cases there are like that, where the reality of what Trump is doing hits home in communities that had supported him, the more interest he has in returning to the violent idea.
Totally. You're entirely right. Also, the perceptual world is really different as we know, in different parts of America. So many people who live on Fox and, their particular podcasts will have no idea about this. In fact, I read about that case, which is a very moving case, in a liberal newspaper. So the people in that town, it was right in front of them, it was unmediated. But for everybody else, it doesn't exist. It
was quite difficult, though, because I think it was the New York Times that followed this really, really closely. And the fact that they talked about the entire effort of a whole village to get her out. But the difficulty was that the people in this village in Missouri had predominantly voted for Trump. And there were still those who had turned up and said, well, hang on a minute. You're going to catch everybody with this new process. So in order to deport the illegal immigrants who they don't want, you might end up deporting some of the illegal immigrants you do want. And it's tricky.
Exactly.
Let's talk about a little bit. I mean, we do have to touch on Trump, Musk. You have written extensively, David, on how to be a good leader. Do you think Musk and Trump have read your book?
The reason I've had to write about how to be a good leader is because the examples of people who are terrible leaders, we don't need books about them. We can just open our eyes and look around the horizon. We've seen them in the schoolyard when we were kids. Some people have experienced them in relationships or in offices. It's easy to be an awful person. One of the points from Edward Gibbon's book on the Roman Empire is that if you have the equivalent of like the cockpit of an airplane and it's connected to really powerful controls, if you put a wonderful person in there, they can do wonderful things. But if you put a terrible person in, then their terribleness is magnified. So the U.S. historically has become very powerful. So you can have a moron and a fool in the White House, and for quite a while there will be higher technology than other people have. They might be destroying the technology of the future and the medicine and the other research of the future. It doesn't matter at the moment because you've given them this powerful tool. Sort of like somebody who inherits a media empire but couldn't create it, or someone who inherits a great deal of money. So the U.S. sadly is experiencing that.
A real estate empire, perhaps.
Have you been remotely surprised by this happening?
Not entirely.
No.
I think of all the events in US politics, the most predictable was that two giant egos would eventually find it difficult to be in the same room. I'm kind of entertained, as I think many people have been, by what happens now. Should they kiss and make up? Should they hug and make up? Neither wants to do that. And Trump has now gone into serious gangster mode by threatening that if Musk does support Democrats or continues to oppose his spending bill, that terrible things can happen to him. So he's gone back into kind of I know where you live and, watch what you say mode. Musk is not likely to want to go quietly either. So I think we have lots of entertainment left in this.
Musk does his own thing.
He's been, some reporting suggested that some of the Wall Street billionaires, so not Silicon Valley, but like
the
Wall
money.
Street, they've been telling him be quiet because we want this tax break for the super rich. And do you see Musk made a few, he supported some tweets saying, one should moderate things. On the other hand, his drug use or his basic personality, I won't put down to drugs, means that it's really hard to be normal for long.
I think that's right, and he did delete the message about Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, which frankly, everyone is having to say without evidence. But the evidence in the photographic evidence of Trump's close relationship with Epstein has been all over the papers forever.
It's very clever. It's once it's out, it's out.
Yes.
The minute that you put Trump and Epstein's names together, regardless of what the veracity of any kind of claims, that mud sticks. It's a very, very clever thing to do. Withdrawing comments has about a tiny percentage of the power of initially making that wild allegation.
I mean, Musk has real interests at stake. He's bidding for the Golden Dome, or wants to bid for the Golden Dome, which is this giant, defense contract. And actually, Trump's right in saying that, Tesla's profits depend pretty much exclusively on subsidies or for the purchase of electric cars, which will come to an end in the end. So he has a lot at stake. But then, people like that tend to imagine that they've created their own empire and that they can do it again. This may or may not be true. So it's a high stakes game at this point. And it's nothing to do with running a good administration, sadly.
That's, I think, one of the fundamental points. These discussions back and forth about whether Musk's empire is taxed in a certain way or not, is not done in terms of what's best for the United States or best for the world. It's done in terms of this petulance back and forth. What's going on, it's coming out in these tweets, is what many people, including in past generations that we would consider more stable generations, people would say privately in the Oval Office or to their friends and stuff. McWhorter, the sociolinguist at Columbia, has been really good about that. Even before the first Trump administration, he said many people think things, but you know that you're not supposed to say them. And there's a wonderful pleasure if somebody speaks in a sophisticated way. If they throw in a single swear word, you feel they're telling the truth. Oh my goodness, look at them throw it in. And now this person is saying this in public. Unfortunately, these things which seem true to many people listening, we do feel these are genuinely what Musk and Trump feel. They tend to be sheer emotion coming out. They're not like a calm evaluation of higher order consequences.
I think that's such a good point, because we used to have to wait 30 years to read the diaries or for the papers to be released to find, the backstory. And now the backstory is all over the walls. And as you say, it's emotion in the moment, which again sets up a different dynamic in terms of public perception and therefore a future reaction. Whereas if it's private, in a way, politics is relatively undisturbed by that.
There is that interesting thing that of all the noise, the one bit of the story that sticks with me is Trump saying that his relationship with Musk is over. And it's that sort of real it's a personal boyfriend split. It's incredible. Where does this go in the future in terms of the fact that in the past, when splits occurred privately and politics was untouched because we didn't hear about it, those days are absolutely over for two reasons. Firstly, everybody plays out everything online nowadays, and it is not just private citizens who play everything out online publicly nowadays. Once you have the leader of the free world playing out every single thought that goes through his brain via his thumbs and online, David, where does that then set future governments, future leaders, future models of government?
When you say the word model, that's really important. The teenage son of an acquaintance of mine in the United States was enjoying mocking Canada because they're weak. Look how the president makes fun of them, and the kid wanted to identify with the bully. Many people will.
Did you put him right? Did you have a word, David?
I wasn't in the same room.
Okay.
So a handful of people will always be ethical. A handful of people will always be thugs, and a great number of people will respond to the mood around them. And so these sort of leaders are setting up this terrible mood. They also that phrase which we used to say, ironically or seriously, the leader of the free world. That I can imagine that disappearing. So instead of the U.S. being isolationist, Ganesh and the FT talk about it quite nicely. What if the U.S. becomes malevolent? It's like, wow, we don't think about that in NATO countries. We think of it, okay, maybe it's withdrawing, but like, oh, what if it's actually becoming malevolent? Really supporting the internal structure of of China and of Russia, but really against the internal structure of Europe, a kind of revulsion against somebody who's offering decency. In the past, this has happened with great powers. They have changed their nature. We might be seeing that now.
And you have that, just looking at that, Isabel, the fact that, as David mentioned, that pivoting towards China is one thing, but also China, for all its power and its might, its narrative is incredibly discreet internationally, isn't it? It keeps itself very quiet.
Oh, very much so. And in fact, in China, if there's a coup, you don't know until it's happened. You don't see it coming, because if you saw it coming, it wouldn't happen. And the message is extremely tightly controlled. So, this is playing very well to China's advantage at the moment, because China presents itself as the responsible, steady power, the power that does what it says, the power that honours the agreements that it signed. Unlike, so Xi Jinping has been selling the narrative of the decline of Western liberal democracies, and Trump is really helping.
Excellent. Exactly.
So it's, China's turn as far as China's concerned.
I think of the world as a young person would see it. So we're aware of that there can be fluctuations in U.S. policy, but underlying it, there's certain stability. So when push comes to shove, it's in a certain direction. Young people without that tradition of seeing that have no reason to believe that.
Absolutely. And this is a particularly spectacular, the Trump-Musk row, because Musk is such a big figure in his own right. But if you think back to the prehistory of Trump 1, I mean, it was this constant stream of people who had been appointed by Trump leaving and then saying this man isn't fit for office. That was the most common theme in Trump 1.
Over and over.
It seemed to make no difference, but we're going to see it again. I mean, Trump has surrounded himself with a very curious collection of people, and they will not be up to the jobs that they're meant to do, and they will depart in tears, and they will say these things.
I largely agree with you, with one exception. The Secretary of Defense can do 47 press-ups in a row. And I believe that's a good reason to be to run the Pentagon in the United States.
Can you do 47 press-ups? I bet you can, actually. Actually, both of you.
Do we believe him?
Yes, that's the trouble. It's probably the one thing that
He was actually, it came out in his, when he was appearing before the Senate, and he was actually preening and delighted about that. And he was not embarrassed about not knowing the fundamentals of names and people involved in NATO. He actually didn't care, but was delighted in this.
It's 9:35 here in London, 10:35 in Oslo. Let's hear from Lars Bevanger, Monocle's Oslo correspondent for the latest from Norway. A very good morning to you, Lars.
Good morning to you.
How are your press-ups?
Oh, I haven't tried for a while, but last time I tried, I think I did 5.
Oh, brilliant. It's 5 more than I can do. I tried 2 days ago. It was an absolute mess. Right, what's happening in Norway?
Well, Norway is still reeling from an amazing victory. Thursday night, Norway's national football team beat Italy 3-0 at home, which was a feat in itself, but it means Norway is pretty certain to go to the World Cup finals next year in the US and Mexico. And that hasn't happened for more than quarter of a century. Last time Norway actually made it to the finals was in 1998.
So, I mean, how much of an element of surprise are we talking about here in Norway? I mean, we don't normally have football corner, but we'll dive straight in. Come on then.
Well, I mean, Norway is a football mad nation, and it's producing some of the most amazing footballers internationally. We've got Erling Haaland at Manchester City at the moment, Martin Ødegaard, Alexander Sørloth. Of course, we had Ole Gunnar Solskjær, who both played for Manchester United and was later their manager. But the national team has never managed to really get together and do anything impressive. So it's been a dearth of disappointment after disappointment. So this time it looks like the team has really come together and made the nation proud. And there's nothing else in the papers, basically. It's completely taken over the news.
Indeed. I mean, what are they? There is only so much coverage that they can do, but how high are they pitching their ambitions in the Norwegian press?
Well, very high now that they've beat Italy, which is a very, very strong side also this year. Everyone's very optimistic about what Norway can actually do at the World Cup finals next year. But that remains to be seen. Of course, there's a lot of very, very good teams and a lot of better teams, I would have thought, than Norway. So we'll have to wait and see first of all, whether they actually make it to the finals. It's not 100% cert, but if they do, we'll just have to see how they do next year.
Let's stay in sport. We're now doing the Norwegian sport slot. This is a new thing for Monocle on Sunday. It may be a one-off. Who knows? Let's see how it goes. In Oslo, there is an absolutely bananas sport called, was it daredevil diving, death diving. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's basically something that started out very small back in the 70s. A group of friends decided they were going to jump from the 10-meter diving tower at the outdoor swimming pool in Oslo and do lots of funny moves or stay completely still, flat on their belly until the moment before they hit the water. They'll curl up into a ball to avoid damage. And they would give points to each other for the most crazy dives. This has grown spectacularly since 2008. They had the first unofficial world championships. 15 people came to watch. Now, last year, there were 3,000, and they have sold TV rights, and it's become an international sport, and it's massive on social media. Now, the problem is that swimming pool is closed for the refurbishment for the next 2 years, and moving it to another site in Oslo is costing money. They're also trying to professionalize the sport further. They've applied for support from Norwegian authorities. They have said it's not actually an official sport, so we can't give you support. In comes Trinidad and Tobago and say, we've got money, we buy the rights. So next year's World Championships will be leaving Norway and going overseas.
Devastating news for the Norwegians and for that swimming pool in particular.
Absolutely. And it's people are lamenting this is maybe the first real sport that's come out of Norway since skiing. now we're losing it to Trinidad and Tobago.
Lars, in the studio, I've got Isabel, Hilton, and David Bodanis. David, in particular, was absolutely hooting at the idea of this swimming pool becoming this global sensation.
I especially like it because I've spent a fair bit of time in Norway with friends there and stuff. And Norwegians have two personalities. One is very calm, stately, maybe with a pipe. The other one is being as insane as possible in public while flailing through the air just before going back into a tight little ball. It's in particular that moment of when they tighten up again a few inches from the bottom. It's like, oh, what have I done? I have to go back to being a proper Norwegian. And then they tighten up.
Lars, how correct and a sort of rather generalisation that we've got from David there. Are you an uncurled or a tightened up Norwegian?
Oh, it depends on the situation, but I think you're spot on there. It is very, Norwegians are quite reserved until you get to know us, and then we basically can flail around a bit in public if needs be.
I can understand why one would want to watch this. I can't for the life of me think why anyone would want to do it, I have to say. But you can take comfort from the thought that you may have lost this to Trinidad and Tobago, but at least the skiing you're not going to lose to Trinidad and Tobago. So you might, take some consolation in that.
Yes, I think you're right. Skiing is something that Norway's always been good at, and it looks like we're still the best in the world, and that's why everyone's as much of a skiing fan as a football fan or a dutzing fan.
I have to say, having spent a lot of my life in Scotland, that the tradition of heroic failure of the football team is very familiar to me. So I can imagine the joy in Norway. That has yet to come to Scotland, I have to say.
Lars, what else have we got to talk about? I mean, the thing that dominated the headlines from a few weeks ago is when an enormous 135-metre container ship beached itself in someone's back garden, and he needed his neighbour to alert him to the fact that this thing was 5 metres from his head in his bedroom. The container ship moved on. If you haven't seen it, everybody just go and look up at the pictures. They're absolutely glorious. The container ship moved on, but the problems have remained. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it did create quite an impact, even though it was sort of a soft landing and the homeowner didn't even wake up until his neighbor alerted him. But what happened was that the ground where it's hit is very much made up of clay, and it triggered several mudslides. And these were fairly big, so they had to evacuate quite a few houses along the shoreline, and they are now waiting for proper geological surveys to basically say that it's safe to go back. There's still people who are waiting to get back to their houses, and some people have lost a lot of land. Now, the issue is who's going to pay for this, because it's going to run into maybe more than €1 million to both carry out the survey and also repair the area. The ship owners say, no, we don't feel responsible, and also there's a court case going on with the crew on the ship to try to apportion blame. The Norwegian authorities say that we're not going to pay because it wasn't our fault. Meanwhile, the people who actually live there are waiting to move home.
So what happens next? Because if we do have everyone saying it's not my fault, apart from perhaps the poor person at the helm, who many said that had dropped off, was dozing off with their 135-metre container ship under their charge. But is it going to be a blame game, or is someone just going to grow up and make it all and sort of sort it all out quite quickly?
Well, we don't know yet, but I'm guessing that once the court case has finished and they've apportioned blame, I would have thought the ship company will have some kind of insurance that would cover an event like this if the crew are found guilty of negligence. You would hope that the employer would have their back and be able to pay. But it depends how long this is going to take, and perhaps the Norwegians will have to fork up the money up ahead of this to allow people to return to normal life.
Lars Bevanger, thank you so much for bringing us all the news from Norway. Isabel, Hilton, David Bodanis, had you seen those pictures of the container ship beforehand?
I hadn't. I mean, they were quite extraordinary, and it reminds me of that. There's a film called I can't remember what it's called actually, but it begins with a family on the beach and a ship slowly approaching and then coming up the beach. It is very cinematic.
We're used to separate categories. We're used to being inside enormous airplanes and complaining bitterly that our films are taking up to 7 or 8 seconds to load, while we're flying through the air 5 miles up with howling winds outside and low air pressure and taking it for granted. If that airplane were to appear sitting on my lap at a Starbucks, I would be very unhappy and people would be very surprised, unless they were working to deadline. So to see the ship there, it reminds us of all these enormous things that are interconnecting in our world, which normally are well regulated.
You will, however, talking of shipping news, which we now seem to be, you may recall that 2 weeks ago, North Korea launched a warship which promptly sunk, which was very bad Korea news.
It was a big week for large ships.
It was a big week for large ships. Well,
For weak large ships.
I know you've been waiting for the next step, which is that they have managed to raise it again. Lacking the machinery to raise this ship, they did it by attaching balloons to it and an awful lot of people on the dock, and they've got it back up again.
Brilliant. Well done, North Korea. What does this now mean? Does this sort of salvage some of the terrible shame that was suffered by Kim Jong-un?
I think it now becomes, if I were running the PR, it would become a heroic story of overcoming obstacles.
Yeah,
yes.
you just need Donald Trump because he turns everything into a win.
Indeed.
Even when he loses. How do people manage to do that, David?
It depends what you focus on. There could be a mudslide in some country killing 10,000 people. One child is saved. If somebody's really, really into religion, they say, well, you look what God did. And so 2 people can look at the scene, 9,909 dead, 1 child saved. And an atheist and a believer will say, yeah, I look at what God did.
And it's one of those interesting things that when you are talking about crisis communications as well, the example that is often given is that, let's say you have an aeroplane and it crashes and 30 people are killed. The aircraft company should not say, well, look, there were 155 people on board. Only 30 people died. And look, everybody else has walked away, because that doesn't necessarily set the correct tone. I mean, the North Koreans and the Chinese, they're very, very good at sort of making something turn into a positive, apart from this ship, because everyone went bananas.
Well, everyone went bananas because it was highly visible. I mean, normally part of the art of successful communications in those regimes is to suppress the bad news. We've just passed the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, not a word spoken in China. So, suppressing bad news is part of it. But of course, when you're launching a ship on a kind of high prestige moment, and the thing sinks, it's rather hard to pretend it didn't happen. So you have to turn it round somehow.
It's funny the assumptions that we carry with us. So one is that in China, this terrible massacre will be suppressed. In the world of Trump, and the world where Trump dominates and the Chinese leadership doesn't have to bother it, the world of the 1930s, people will revel in it. As we were getting little hints of in Los Angeles, reveling in the brutality given to people who are weaker. There's an enjoyment in that for many people.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm glad that people are embarrassed by this and hide it rather than revel in it.
Let us move on to another story. What have you spotted, David? You wanted to talk about a sort of cybercrime. Actually, you wanted to talk about the Ukrainian drone story, which has been around for a couple of weeks, but it is one of those things that actually, at the end of, is causing huge consternation about people assessing whether, in fact, this has changed the nature of warfare.
So there's drones in general, and this attack in particular. So what I was struck by is, a transistor works not by generating a lot of power, but by regulating a power source going through. It's like a little valve on a sink. I can't pour water out with my little wrist at high pressure in my home, but if the city of London pours water right up into my house, I can just turn a little valve that lets it in and out. So the 9/11 attackers in New York in 2001, they couldn't get a vast amount of fuel up to the top of the World Trade Center for explosives, so they borrowed it from the airplanes. It was a horrible thing, but sadly on engineering levels, that was ingenious. So terrorists will, or military people will often do that. In World War II, when America destroyed Japanese cities, they were unable to bring enough fuel and explosives to destroy the cities. All they had to bring was the equivalent of a match. The cities were made of wood. And so all the power and the energy was there. So similarly with Ukraine, to fly drones undetected into Siberia the Ukrainians couldn't do. I don't know if there's any Western power that could do it. But you borrow the road network and the shipping network and the ability for people in Russia to use phones to synchronize when freelance lorry drivers do this or that. And that's what they were able to do. They were able to literally hitchhike on it. And then you saw those wonderful pictures of the tops of them opening up and these things flying out. Countries like the U.S. and the U.K. are incredibly vulnerable to this. There might well be, if I were an enemy power, I would just make sure there's lots of lorries parked all sorts of places around the U.S. and the U.K. It's very tempting to keep one's eyes closed.
And it's a very interesting world now. And I'm now thinking immediately of China, Isabel, that the whole Ukraine story dependent on what David was mentioning there, of someone very cleverly using existing infrastructure.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a people's war in that sense.
It's the private sector as well, which is, there's so much now in terms of the crossover between states and the private sector, given the fact that the infrastructure is usually quite commonly privately owned. The Chinese are very, very good at getting involved in other countries' infrastructure, either like openly or perhaps a little less openly.
Mm.
Well, but both of those. I mean, the open part is that in order to avoid the catastrophe of climate change, we are undergoing across the world an energy transition. And the technology of that transition, due to pretty smart planning 15, 20 years ago, is coming from China. I mean, the trilemma is that we need to address climate change quickly, cheaply and safely, and you can have two of those, but not three. You can do it quickly and cheaply with Chinese technology, but the security risk is that you are attaching technologies to your national infrastructure. Well, you don't even have to, have a drone or a lorry involved. You can flick a switch from very far away and crash the national grid. Or you can flick a switch from far away and a lot of electric vehicles will stop in the rush hour in London. You can create distractions. You can create much more serious incidents, but you can create a whole series of small incidents which create confusion, distraction, cost money, and effort to fix. And you can look entirely innocent. That's the attraction of grey zone warfare, that the attribution is extremely difficult. So, we don't know if the Chinese want to do this, but they certainly have the capacity to do it now. And it's not particularly helped by the discovery in some US solar farms the other week of undeclared technology within the Chinese technology. So items that were not on the manifest that appeared to be designed to get round a firewall, for example. So there's quite a lot of reason for concern.
David, you wanted to talk about the issue of cybersecurity there, which is what Isabel's just mentioned. And trust.
Exactly. So one of the only ways to reduce that is to have all these totally separate countries with these totally separate small economies. And the problem there, then you get really angry.
A bit late for that, I think.
Yeah. Or if you do it, you kind of go backwards and you get that attitude of sort of the Italian far right or even a medium right, which is this fragility. It's like if you hate your enemies. So clearly Merkel's policies with Russia didn't work the way she intended. But the idea behind it was plausible. And many times in the past, it has worked. So in fact, the places where it's worked very well, it's worked so well that you don't even notice it. So the integration of the various U.S. states and the integration of the North and the South of the U.S. through trade, or Canada and the U.S. and until very recently, when it works so well that you have those links, we're fine. France and England, for example.
Yes, but the German approach of Wendel durch Handel, which is change through trade, applied both to China and to Russia, pretty much crashed and burned when Russia invaded Ukraine.
That's what I'm saying.
And the trust
was wrong.
Just went.
Yes.
And
sadly,
and we're now living with the aftermath of a whole set of very intimate connections which were built on the assumption that trust would grow.
Yes.
And that's a real dilemma.
You're entirely right. And indeed, before the First World War, trust was really high and there was great interconnection. So it doesn't necessarily work. But the hope is that You know what it is? It works except in the cases where it doesn't, which is why politics is an art, not a science, and why intellectuals are usually so terrible at politics, because you find simple abstract principles which are plausible and powerful and wrong.
That interconnectedness, though, is something that the philosopher Joseph Nye, who wrote for us a couple of weeks before he died, talked about in terms of soft power and deterrence, that actually if you have an interconnectivity, in the same way that nuclear deterrence operates, if one goes, it brings everybody down. So is there that sense that actually it may be not quite trust, but there is that knowledge that if I try and bring you down, I bring everyone down?
Well, there are some areas in which you have real reciprocity. We can, in theory, cut each other's cables, shoot down each other's satellites, and so on. But actually, in the critical national infrastructure, there is such a monopoly now of Chinese technology that and in any event, I don't think China would welcome the presence of foreign firms on their national infrastructure. They certainly don't. They impose restrictions, for example, on where you can drive Tesla cars. So they're very, very aware of
Correct.
the security risks. Yeah. So no, I mean, in order to have deterrence, you have to have a measure of equal harm, and we don't have that at the moment. It's a bit unbalanced.
You're entirely right. And China, I think, has this awareness because of having been the weaker power for so long. Weaker powers have to notice what's going on. Sort of film directors and scriptwriters are usually like the nervous, awkward kid from high school, because the really confident, happy kid, they don't have to pay attention to anybody else. In the way that sports coaches, the top sports coaches, with a few noticeable exceptions, have usually been plausible and not super successful players because they have to be aware. There's many examples.
Go on, sorry.
Michael Jordan knew how to play basketball very well. And as a coach, he was terrible because he would say, well, what you do is you got to flick your wrist, not too early, but just flick your wrist at the right time. And people say, yeah, right.
He couldn't understand why people couldn't do it.
All you have to do is flick at the right time. Ted Williams had the highest percentage batting record of anybody in modern times. He unfortunately played for Boston, but everybody has mistakes. Anyways, and he would tell people the way he did it was you don't hit the ball in the middle when it's coming at you. You got to go about an eighth or a quarter of an inch below the middle when it's coming at you, and then swing slightly up. And he said it's really simple. That's all you have to do. People throw those balls at really high speed. If one was thrown at me, I would try to crouch down and be like a Norwegian diver.
We have 1 minute to talk about weddings.
Oh, my favourite wedding.
Yes.
A Vietnamese bride was given lots and lots of civet cats in her diary by her father. Why, you ask yourself? Well, civet cat I don't know if anyone's ever seen a pine marten. They look a bit like pine martens, but different colouring. And they're very, very cute. But when the Dutch got to Java and planted coffee, the civet cats ate all the coffee. And the Dutch, unwilling to lose their coffee, instructed the servants to pick up the excrement and extract the coffee beans. This has now become a highly desirable coffee, immensely expensive, and in Vietnam and lots of Southeast Asia, these poor creatures, the civet cats, are kept in cages and fed coffee in order that it go through their digestive system. So may you live happily and prosperously, bride, and here are your civet cats.
Best wedding. Did anyone have a dowry at their wedding? No?
No, I didn't have the civet cats.
No. Anything good for you?
I was just wondering, I haven't looked inside the coffee making machines at my places in London, but I have heard squeaking sounds from within. I'm worried.
David Bodanis, Isabel, Hilton, thank you so much for joining me around the desk today on Monocle on Sunday. And thanks to Lars Bevanger and Ed Stocker. Thanks to our producer, Desiree Bandley and Mariella Bevan. And our studio engineer was Mariella as well. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sundays, back at the same time next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. And if you're drinking coffee, spare a thought for those cats. Goodbye.